Righty, so here we are, live and direct from my living room with some fairly questionable lighting. I can see the little and the reality is here we are live on this wonderful new streaming tool I've got called Melon, and super exciting to be with you. So this is the first live stream I've done in quite some time, and so I'm really, really psyched to be back creating and sharing everything that the Sovereign Human Show was set up and designed to do. And when I actually look at the podcast element of the show, of course, I go live out onto the beautiful radio waves of Falmouth via the Source FM. So hello to the Source FM listeners, for those who are listening in. And I also then upload it as a podcast, and quite often will live stream it to my various social profiles where possible. And of course, now even more possible with this new live streaming tool. And what I recognize is that there has been a significant disconnect between the shows that I've put out either on Source FM or on live on Facebook, and those that have ultimately ended up as podcasts on Apple and Spotify, etc. And so today marks what I hope will be a change in that trend. Since making some moves in my own life that I shall speak more about shortly, I recognize that now more than ever is a time when I have to be sharing what needs to be shared from my heart. So that is the intention. And tonight, I've got my little notes over here. Let me just make sure that I kind of let you know everything we're going to cover. We are going to get into simulation theory. So, and this is one that could blow some people's minds for sure. When I tell you that probably since the last time I checked in with a show, I think I've probably managed to go from being a full-on kind of like globe, the Earth is round, then like taking a little dally into is the Earth flat, and arriving now at actually a frame of reference that I believe can support both of those visions. We're also going to get into some, and by the way, probably most of you are thinking, oh my God, George has totally lost it since I saw you last. But actually, let me speak a bit more about that in a moment. I just want to let you know what else we're going to cover tonight. So we're going to look at kind of late stage in life, kind of neurodivergence diagnoses. So recently I got actually diagnosed with ADHD, which was it's been quite a journey. I think I mentioned it in previous shows as a possibility. We're also going to look at some of the real core elements of boarding school stuff, because I think I'd been perhaps assuming it wasn't as big a thing as it is, and so it's really been something that's kind of woken me up since actually starting some therapy work, so I can speak more about that as well. And then also diving into a new direction in my life. So since recording a show last, my time with as a member of staff at Falmouth University has come to an end, and I've actually joined as a student in their venture studio. They run a master's program called Launchpad, and the aim of Launchpad is that you get a master's in entrepreneurship alongside building, hopefully, a high-growth startup. So very exciting times, and I will be sharing more of that journey to come. So here we are. Thank you for tuning in. I can see got our first viewers coming along, and that is wonderful to have you. I'll see if I can kind of find you by name by diving into who's watching in various places. If you are tuning in, then please do pop a comment. I'd love to see if they come up in the chat of this new live stream I've got, or if I have to kind of go over to Facebook to get them. But let me know you're here. As and when you arrive, as and when you tune in, even if you tune in for a short period, do let me know you're here. Let me know by now, if you're tuning into this, you kind of know some of the things I'm interested in, some of the things I'm fascinated with. And don't worry, I'm going to close the loop in a moment on that whole kind of flat earth little mention that I just did. The things that I love to cover to some degree, and perhaps you've seen enough of me to think, I kind of maybe I respect George's opinion about X, Y, and Z. And so if you've got some questions, pop those up as well, because I'm always curious to know what kinds of show topics I might be able to expand upon that perhaps I hadn't considered. So hit me up with a comment. Let me know you're here as a very basic, and then perhaps also some kind of show ideas or questions that you might have. So, as promised, let me close the loop on that, because on the flat Earth piece, because that is a thing that it's almost like I'm trying to think of a similar example where I'm really like over the last, well, particularly I think, in fact, if I look at this over the course of the pandemic, but also if I now look back and think, well, over the course of the case that was made to go to war in Iraq, all right, like my way of operating is to be cautious and cherishing, my other friends and family would probably say outright dismissive of the official kind of mainstream narratives that we're given. And that I'm cautious for good reason, because we have been deceived consistently. All right. Some of the latest data breakdowns of the, medical procedure that was rolled out recently globally. They were doing a kind of a risk-benefit kind of ratio analysis. And I don't know the exact ins and outs of the maths, but what I do know is that essentially, in weighing up whether a medical intervention should be executed, I've currently got my hand being bitten by a Labrador. Mate, I don't need you in the show. I'm okay. I've got it covered. All right. In weighing up whether a medical procedure should be given, they will do what's called a risk-benefit ratio. And if the number is a minus number when they've kind of worked all the data, then it can be shown that essentially for every person that they do the medical treatment for, they're going to save, basically. There is a thing where they will save more people than they harm through the medical intervention, and thereby, by virtue of that, they should do it, right? The numbers for, I think it was the under 12s, came out as plus 1,600. And so if I've understood that correctly, what that means literally is that for every person they save from the medical intervention, they would kill 1,600 of age 12 and under, which is a staggering stat when you consider that the data they used to extrapolate that risk-benefit ratio was the UK government's own, like from the Office of National Statistics. That's mind-boggling. And yet the message that we have been continued to be given is, of course, safe and effective. So it is examples like that that lead me to be very suspicious, very cautious of mainstream narratives. And so even with that said, I was still like, pretty much everyone in thinking that, the whole flat earth thing was some kind of, like that was a step too far, right? I can believe in the fact that we perhaps exist in a universe that's teeming with life, that, like extraterrestrials have visited our planet for many, many, many thousands of years and will continue to do so, right? Like that's, okay, well, that's not much of a stretch these days when, you're getting all of these different files and images and videos being declassified. But what is a stretch for most people, most sane people, is to suggest that the Earth could be flat. And the thing that's interesting here is for you, as you listen to this, as you watch this, to track your own emotional response to that statement. Because bearing in mind, I've actually not said whether this is something I ascribe to as a theory or viewpoint or not. I've simply opened it as part of a conversation. And so how do you like experience that notion? Is there parts of you that are like, George, an idiot, what's he talking about? Like, are you getting perhaps riled up in some way? Is it in some way offensive to you that I should even bring this into some kind of serious conversation? And if that is the case, then that is fascinating to me. How is it that just a concept, an idea, can be the source of both such, what's the word I'm looking for? Like derision, scorn, and even go beyond that to be one that's like emotionally triggering for people. And the reason why I've actually given it some exploration time since I last did a show is for that very reason, that anytime there is something that is so like roundly like where the kind of consensus reality is so strong around it, and or the forces to maintain that consensus reality are so strong, then it piques my curiosity. And the staggering thing that I discovered in just checking out a few videos on the topic was that even in some schools, like this last century, the idea that the Earth was flat was being taught, and that gave my brain a moment of pause. And so I was like, well, that's very strange, because surely for centuries everyone has known that the Earth is round. Like surely it's like the accepted viewpoint. I couldn't even believe that in schools this notion was being taught even last century, and yet it was. And as I then started to look further into this, I was like, oh well, actually there are some very, very valid questions that proponents, and by the way, like the proponents of flat Earth theory, one of the frustrating things is that in many cases they seem to get as riled up and emotional about their theory as those who will champion the perspective that the Earth is round. And that's frustrating as well, because I'm actually like, I am open-minded enough to know that it is an absolute fact that, for example, like NASA has been caught doctoring images, right? Guaranteed, no questions asked, it's in the public sphere, okay? So with that as a fact, then it's not as simple to simply go, okay, all of you crazy flat earthers, like when you say that images of the Earth are fake, like there's no substance to that. Because unfortunately, because of NASA's actions, we don't have a solid basis of fact from which to make that assertion. Okay. And so the other piece that did catch my eye was of some of the images of old maps that show two things. Land actually beyond Antarctica, with the Earth kind of laid out on a flat plane on a map. Earth beyond Antarctica, and indeed Earth beyond the North Pole. And the reason why this is interesting as well is that we know, for example, the Piri-Reis map, as quoted by Graham Hancock and others in some of their work, shows the outline of Antarctica in terms of its land mass without the covering of ice. And the last time, of course, that the land mass of Antarctica was without ice was like millennia ago. And so we have a challenge that maps from antiquity, which we know to have had a staggering degree of accuracy that we can't really explain, also show detailed topography of land beyond both the poles. And that would, of course, only be possible if the Earth wasn't, in fact, a globe. So without coming to any hard and fast conclusions, like what I was forced to arrive at was the clarity that there are some valid questions being posed, questions that deserve a less emotional response from both sides of the debate. And things like the fact that most images we have of the Earth are composite images, and indeed that, for example, what you might think is this seeing the curvature of the Earth out of an airplane window. From what I understand, all airplane windows have a slight kind of fisheye aspect to them that gives the impression of curvature. So there's some fascinating stuff there, and that was almost like a stopping off point for me in some of my recent research, where I've now arrived at a really fascinating place around the idea of simulation theory. And of course, this is not a new theory at all. Even folks like Elon Musk have kind of trotted out confidently that when you really assess everything, it seems very likely that we are in some kind of simulation. And one of the ideas that I'd come across, like in passing, I hadn't really engaged with to any great degree, was the notion that for some time our reality had been hijacked by a rogue AI. And so if we consider this, that what we are experiencing, like we put on, the other day I put on for the first time one of those kind of headsets, and it was a profound experience to be so immediately and so completely drawn into a different reality. And it really got me to wondering, well, how would you know? That same notion of like, does a fish know it's wet? How would we be able to assess whether we were inside of some form of kind of holographic reality projection or tunnel? And some of the researchers that I've come across exploring this notion point to simulation theory as being one of the few things that can actually explain like a lot of the anomalous archaeology and timeline things that we come across. And this, I'm very, very much in the early stages of this research, but one of the kind of stories that's doing the rounds of late is the notion of kind of the Tartarian Empire. And again, in this conversation about old maps, the kind of the land of Tartaria appears on a lot of these old maps. And now you get these kind of YouTube explorations of cities that existed, particularly in America, as one of the examples given. But these anomalous architectural like marvels. Australia is another example, where, for example, like you look at something like the Sydney Courthouse, or like the kind of the old town in Sydney, and you're just like, the maths doesn't like really struggle to make the maths stack up in terms of the numbers of people who were supposedly like taken to Australia in the colonies versus the level of manpower and expertise required to create some of the buildings. And this is the kind of I don't know enough about masonry and engineering to be able to kind of assert either way. But those who claim some expertise in those fields say, when you actually pause and really think about it, it's a really difficult notion to get your head around, that some of this architecture, both in America and in Australia particularly, could have been created in the way that others say, or the way that the kind of the common narrative suggests. And so there's this idea that there seems to be some kind of missing recent technological civilization. And then the other challenge, of course, that goes with this, that is often kind of connected up, is this notion of reset and of mud floods. And so, you can just do a very simple kind of Google search for kind of, mud flood, photos. And what you will find is like entire buildings at street level that then they've been built on top of, or seem to have had multiple stories of buildings, like literally covered by a deluge of mud. And so you'll see where they've almost like excavated out new foundations. They found, whole stories of buildings with windows and things like underground. And so it's almost as if like the entire building like just dropped a few stories into this pool of kind of mud, and then the mud solidified again, and you just had a new street level, which was 2 or 3 stories lower than it previously was. And so all of that is like it's just this fascinating. There is fascinating little data points that are really tough to explain according to conventional archaeology, conventional like chronology. And so, I mean, I was, exploring a lot of those previously without any real way of kind of squaring the circle. And then kind of actually coming across some of this more serious conversation around simulation theory as one of the things that potentially could tie all of this together. And, there are, talk of various kind of, forthcoming, resets and stuff. If you look at the different timelines of when there have been consistent resets, and the number 138 years is given. And in some of the kind of old Jewish texts, it talks about the angel of death visiting every 138 years. And so some of this research pointing to the idea that perhaps every 138 years, there are some kind of reset experiences within the simulation, within the holography that we exist within. And the thing that I found powerful about this, and this will perhaps segue us into some of the other things I wanted to discuss, was actually, rather than causing me to be in a bit of a funk when I discover that perhaps we're in some kind of simulation, it's actually been quite an empowering experience, because prior to it, I actually was I was in a real dark place. Perhaps for the last 6 weeks or so, I'd found myself, like, even with a load of like awesome stuff happening, like starting a new a new direction in life and things, I was, and the terms I used recently was like I was really staring down an abyss. And recently, the notion that we're in a hologram, that we're in this simulation, and that indeed our consciousness can program this simulation, because the way that the simulation might make it almost like seamless to us to appear that we are in a simulation, would be for it to feed back to us as physical reflections the contents of our inner world. All right. And so, notions like what you believe you become. And I heard recently another one like you experience what you are, right? So would be a way for some rogue AI potentially to pull the wool over our eyes. And yet, of course, what it also means is that the more that, and this, of course, starts to delve into notions like law of attraction and stuff like that, that I think has been quite a kind of like almost diluted notion. But that it starts to give some kind of perhaps scientific underpinning, even if perhaps we don't fully understand the science yet. If we accept that our consciousness is part of the interface of the simulation itself, and that therefore through our consciousness we can program the simulation, well then, we are in a position where we can perhaps start to shape the unfolding of our reality in a way that might work for us. And perhaps it's just a placebo. Perhaps that's all it is. But since coming across this notion of simulation theory, and that perhaps it is one of the theories of how reality works that perhaps ties together like quite a vast swathe of the research areas that I've been fascinated by. In the last couple of weeks of coming across this, and particularly perhaps even in the last week, I've really consciously been trying to almost just program my own personal field, my own personal hologram and reality tunnel, if you like, with like certainty and positivity and love and powerful intention. And I've had some very, very strange, random, beneficial, awesome stuff start to happen. And so I'm not counting any chickens yet. But my hope is that perhaps from the dark space I was in, there is a shift starting to occur. And so I'm very happy to, if you're interested in some of this stuff, let me know in the comments, and I will endeavor to kind of dig in a bit more and find out more about this notion. So the dark place, because a deep motivation, a deep purpose for creating the Sovereign Human Show is, of course, to support the development of our personal and planetary sovereignty across those 4 domains of sovereignty: sense-making, self-determination, self-expression, and service. And a key part of that, of course, is finding ways to support ourselves individually, collectively, to do the inner work required. And I have to own at this stage, perhaps, to some hubris, to some arrogance, and what I'm perhaps discovering now, to some grandiosity, likely, really created through trying to survive the experience of a decade at boarding school. But the grandiosity, perhaps, if it was there, the naivety, the arrogance, was around thinking like perhaps I'd done most of my work. For those of you who are listening, I'm holding up the air quotes there. And the reality is, for the last 5 years or so, I've been pretty relentless in seeking out ways to face and address my shadow, to integrate parts of myself that I've rejected, to kind of face and to heal and love, traumas with a big and a small T. And yeah, I remember it would have been perhaps mid-April time, when I was still working at the university. One day, just, putting my head on my desk and sobbing. Just sobbing because, I had to fill in this spreadsheet, and I was just finding it so tough to fill in this spreadsheet. And, I was just finding it so hard to find motivation for the things that I knew I had to do to kind of, earn the wage that I was being paid. And at the same time, just feeling like insanely overwhelmed, like feeling like I was a failure because I wasn't exercising, I was eating rubbish stuff, like just a catalogue of ways that I was shaming myself and just being hard on myself. And so it just got to the point where I was like, enough of this, like, and just sobbing at my desk. And that was a point where I realized, did I even realize at that point? Because I still resisted for some time. Like my partner, Cherish, and others had been suggesting that, if it was the case that perhaps I, had some kind of neurodivergence, and that I had these experiences, that perhaps, perhaps there was some deeper stuff that I wasn't even getting close to looking at yet. And I think I was resistant to that idea, like I said, because of this arrogance, this grandiosity, this feeling like, I've done 5 years of putting some work in, and surely that was enough, right? And I think sobbing at the desk was the crack that perhaps began to let the abyss in. Now, you've probably heard the phrase, the crack that lets the light in, right? Well, perhaps that was the crack that allowed me to begin to acknowledge that the abyss existed, that there was more to do, and perhaps that all of the last 5 years, as I've come to see it now, was almost just like lifting the lid, like lifting up the trapdoor so I could truly stare into the depths of the abyss. And so what is that abyss? Well, it's something I'm still unpacking. But to recognize that for all that I've had gifts and privileges and a whole host of advantages that I can't ever not acknowledge. I can also now begin to speak with an unguarded heart. That's the key phrase, yeah, with an unguarded heart. And even as I say that, I can feel a lot of emotion rising. That I can speak with an unguarded heart about the fact that until about 3 weeks ago, I had undiagnosed ADHD. And for so long, I was resistant to that label. And it may still just be a label I try on from time to time, but having gone through the diagnosis process, thinking I was actually just checking in on my dyslexia and just see if there's any ways that I could make the studies that I've embarked upon easier. Well, the report came back that I wasn't in fact dyslexic, but I was very much ADHD. And alongside that, I thought, well, perhaps I should take up the invitation of my family and my partner to perhaps investigate the route of some therapy, some psychotherapy. And so I feel like I lucked out on coming across a psychotherapist who specializes in working with people who have got neurodivergence. And also through his own personal interests has, really deeply studied the boarding school question as well. And since giving myself permission to begin to speak about these things and to have it reflected back in ways and with words that perhaps I wasn't even cognizant of. Is that the right word? Cognizant? Aware of, let's go with that. What some of those experiences are. And recognizing as they've been reflected back to me, just ways in which I played out. So one of the things I recognized is just how much I developed like this really barbed wit and intelligence that was hyper vigilant for differences in others as a way of almost like preemptively attacking so that I might stay safe from attack myself. Despite feeling in this environment that something I don't fully like feel normal, like, and trying to work out like what it was about me that was I just weird? Was I just different? Like, why throughout my boarding school career I'd had to walk such a fine line between like allowing myself to be authentically me and being like attacked for being a weirdo. And as a result, I developed this like just a hyper keen like awareness, like almost like a kind of like sniper scope to be able to spot potential weirdness or particularly weakness in others. And occasionally physically, but more often than not like verbally or with like some kind of like malevolent stratagem to be able to attack before I was attacked. And I see how much my kind of entire life to this point has been me, that wrestle between almost like the acceptable, presentable personality, self, that I had to put on and become in order to survive being at boarding school, versus the authentic aspect of myself that wanted to be me, wanted to be kind of like weird, whatever weird means, right? And that there was this, right at the very start of my journey, this seminal moment that kind of captured the essence of this like duality that I had to then exist in. I remember going to just before I started at boarding school at 8 years old, which would have been 1995. The family had, thanks to my grandfather, come into some money, and we went on holiday to Barbados that summer before I was due to start at boarding school. And I got my hair braided into this little kind of braid. And I think I had like 3 or 4 of them down the side and then some at the back. And I kept one. And I wanted to keep one when I went to boarding school. And I remember like my mother just like telling me I had like on the driveway of the school, like I'd kept it that long and I had to cut it off. And as I look back now, I realized that my mother was trying to protect me. And how crazy that like this authentic expression of me wanting to have this like unique piece, that like this unique way of expressing myself that was mine alone, like that had to be sacrificed so that I could be safe into the world I was being thrust into. And in starting to unpick this, like I see how I just had to numb out the emotional like pain and anger of essentially like sacrificing my authentic self. And as I look back now, when I factor in that kind of the sacrifice of authenticity, and when I layer up that with the kind of the recent discoveries around the neurodivergence, what unfolds, or what appears, is this really tricky, like what's the word I'm looking for? It's not like mess, but perhaps it is, I don't know, whereby there's some kind of like neurodivergent and autistic, perhaps hardwiring, if you like, that then gets overlaid with a whole load of like protection, trauma-based software. And sometimes the trauma-based software will look like the hardwiring, and sometimes the hardwiring will look like the trauma-based software. And so this is where I find myself at now, is deeply inquiring into like, what is my authentic self? How am I supposed to show up? And like, what is the I that authentically wants to show up? And all of this inquiry and all of this kind of lifting the lid on some of the deep stuff, coming at a time when I've chosen a new direction. I've stopped the kind of quote unquote 9 to 5 that I loved, by the way. I loved elements of it, and yet I now see, as I sat with my head on the desk sobbing, like why I was so challenged by the spreadsheet, because and I was there just going like, why am I so fucking useless? Why can't I just do this? Why can't I be normal, right? And as part of that, I came across a book called Faster Than Normal. Faster Than Normal. And it's a book that like makes the case and gives almost like a playbook for turning an ADHD or ADD brain into a kind of superpower. And like, wow, did I take a lot from that book, because, and this was kind of really started to sow the seeds that this perhaps isn't just something where it's like a frivolous diagnosis. And I've heard people say, oh, ADHD doesn't exist. And like, I'm going to be totally honest and say, like, I was there at points. I was there going like, no, you're just being lazy. You're just being useless, George. You're like, come on, sort it out. And of course, there are going to be times when I procrastinate on stuff, whether you and I, we will procrastinate like that. Again, that's hardwired in. Like epigenetically, procrastination is an outstanding survival tool. Like, to not have to expend energy until you need to, like, great survival tool, right? But to then read in chapter after chapter someone who was speaking about experiences that were like so detailedly accurate to how I operated and how my life was at times, in both good and bad, was yeah, it was a profoundly moving experience. Like, despite having never met the author, to feel like seen, to feel like acknowledged. And it's something that actually has proven to be really important, is to also be able to see myself and to acknowledge myself and say, okay, like this may be how I'm hardwired. Now, how do I seize this as an opportunity? Because the reality is that whilst like I will take days, and it still frustrates me, and I still, like, even here live here with you, want to start beating myself up for this, but like I will still take days to fill in a spreadsheet that might take someone else literally 10 minutes. And yet I can have a 5-minute conversation with someone, and because of how I have learned to recognize certain patterns and hear certain things, and I don't know, tune into certain frequencies, I can reflect back to some things based on a 5-minute conversation that will alter for the better the entire direction of that person's life. And and I've had this where when I, when I started working at university, some of the students would be like, George, like this 10-minute conversation, I've got more from this 10-minute conversation than from the entire 2 years of my degree. And I don't say that as like bigging me up, but it's just to recognize that, like, I can do that. Like, put me in certain situations and I will add more value in 10 minutes than an entire 2 years worth of degree. And that's not to belittle a degree in any way, shape, or form. It's just that because of how I'm wired and how I therefore have learned to process data and to like trust my intuition, I can access insights that just cannot be accessed, without chatting to me in some situations, right? And yet I can't fucking fill in a spreadsheet almost to save my life, like 100%. Put a gun to my head and I'll get it done. But like, so I realized that for so long, I've been trying to run from the gifts and the curses of this kind of neurodivergence, this neurodifference. And I've also been running from the gifts and the curses of what it took to survive boarding school. And indeed, even to begin speaking about the boarding school piece. And recently I did some kind of deep psychedelic work. And one of the things that was really shown to me clearly was that even though it was not something that I thankfully experienced, that there was, paedophile activity occurring at my school, at my prep school particularly. I don't know about my secondary boarding school, but at my prep school, there, like both my French teacher, my cricket teacher, and my football teacher, like my French, like he taught French as well. Both were convicted of paedophile offences. The brother of one of my dear friends, when I was at prep school, committed suicide because of what he'd suffered at the hands of one of them. And like it just showed, like even though nothing physical happened to me that I'm aware of, still in my field, like within my energy field, like that imprint of that energy, of that predation, of that malevolence is present. And I've really, really taken like immense benefits from being able to speak with a therapist about this. And to be able to have a space where I can speak, I can unburden my heart in a space free of judgment, like insanely valuable. And every one of us has that same capacity to be able to really listen to someone without judgment. And there was a time, over the last 5 years when I was quite dismissive of talk therapy, where I was much more an advocate for kind of, deep group somatic process work and, like crazy deep psychedelic work and, or like, all kinds of kind of, somatic work, trauma release and all that stuff. And because I'd also heard people in those settings say that they feel like over the course of a weekend, they'd shifted as much as 10 years of therapy, right? And in some situations that may be true, but and I think I developed this kind of either or perspective. But as I now consider how to move forward with my own mission and vision to support men and women who've been to boarding school through this kind of vehicle of UnBoarded Life, because of the value that I am taking now from this 5-year journey of lifting the lid through all of that other kind of work, like to now also be in a space where even at the very early stage, I'm getting a huge amount of benefit from some psychotherapy. And so to wonder, what does a toolkit look like? What does a toolkit look like that could really support those who've had that experience, those who've had to learn to survive? And then what might it look like to be able to create the circumstances where that experience is, like, the gifts of that experience are harnessed as well? Because I think, like I said, that in order to survive, I developed this capacity for like really like hyper vigilant, but also like precise thinking, and also kind of like almost like divergent thinking as well, to go, okay, well, like, is this all there is? Like, to really deeply inquire into what that experience gave me, and beneath the shell, beneath this false personality that I had to create to survive, what were the gifts that were, almost like a diamond, the pressure of the shell over time metamorphosing, my authentic self into something with some really powerful gifts. And I've come across this notion in other people I've spoken to, that in a workplace environment, they always seem to be able to, for example, like ask the question that no one else is asking. And they notice that they've always been able to do this because of, what their experience were at boarding school, or they've been able to really deeply empathize because of how tough they had it at boarding school. They've always been able to then, whenever someone else had it tough, to just instinctively, like in an embodied way, feel into how that other person was feeling. So this is going to be a focus of the Sovereign Human show going forward, is to explore very much those four pillars of sovereignty: sense making, self-determination, self-expression, and service. With some additional filters to the lens, if you like, or some additional lenses for the perspective. I'm not quite sure what the metaphor is that I'm looking for there, but to really bring in a really deep consideration of this boarding school piece. I hope as a lens through which to view the impact of trauma overall, or one of them, upon our capacity as individuals and as communities and a society to flourish. Because as I speak that, and this is something I've been really deeply inquiring into in my my initial ventures into venture building with my master's in entrepreneurship, is that flourishing is the deep need of our current time. And that indeed, if I pause to consider that is what boarding school shuts down, perhaps more than anything else, is the authentic flourishing of the soul, of the incarnated soul, in favor of churning out acceptable empire managers. And ultimately, that's what the boarding school system was, really like developed and expanded for, was to create this managerial and ruling class for the empire, where people could be sent to the farthest flung reaches of the empire of the world, and be relied upon to essentially have no emotions about the situation, and to just kind of logically progress forward by imposing English values and ways of working no matter what. And so the authentic flourishing of the individual was shut down in service to an ideal. And interestingly, we see that playing out today. That perhaps in some situations, the choices around bodily autonomy are shut down in favor of an ideal. And actually not necessarily an ideal that genuinely has human interest at its heart. Far more an ideal that is built around profit and coercion, around surveillance and control. And I think that one of the questions that I've arrived at as I've really dived into this venture building. So to kind of close out our time together for this re-inaugural Sovereign Human Show, now live streaming out to the world. Where I'm at now is that I have entered the Falmouth University Launchpad program, which aims to build high growth startups that are seeking to do awesome stuff in the world. And what I love about it is that what you hand in to earn your masters is the business plan for a hopefully incorporated, high growth startup. And of course, a business plan is one of the core funding documents. If you're going to go out to kind of seek investment capital, you need to really have a solid business plan in place. And so that is where I'm at. And currently, we're really in the stage of trying to define what it is that each of us, both as either individuals or teams, wants to build. And for myself, this key question of flourishing is really present for me because, and I will likely do a show on this in the coming weeks, my deep concern is that very few of us recognize the scope of what could play out in terms of food security. I know we're starting to hear rumblings in the mainstream media. However, from some of the analysts that I tune into, those really seem to be the potential tip of the iceberg in terms of what we could be facing. And I might think that I was a lone voice, kind of like crying in the wind, if I hadn't met on my cohort, my master's cohort, a former trader who actually kind of sold up and moved out here to the West Country so that they had their own land and that they could actually, take control of their own, food resilience and self-sufficiency. And so that becomes this idea of flourishing. That becomes a really key part of it. Is that for the next 2 or 3 years, potentially we are staring down the consequences of crop failures, of massive like food processing plant fires, which are really dodgy. Like this is my 2 penny worth there. In the same way that it's really dodgy to see so many healthy sportsmen collapsing on the pitch. Like hundreds, where in previous years, like the numbers didn't even get into 2 hands, right? And of course, we know the only thing that changed about the years when all of these players started collapsing, and that issue of bodily autonomy and medical interventions. And to then see the extent to which the predatory wealth of our planet, and I've spoken about this at some length in previous shows as well, have made moves to secure, land, water, and kind of food supplies, speaks to something that deserves much greater investigation and consideration, and that points to, for each of us, the question of how can we, and this is something I'm really chewing on within my masters, within this venture building, how can we flourish? Like, what are the conditions, particularly like for communities, knowing that individuals are, when they talk about the things that can combat depression, they have the acronym of SHEDS, right? Social, hobbies, exercise, I can't think what D is, diet, and S, the final S, I can't think off the top of my head. But so like the first one, social, right? So recognizing, and this, it comes back to this idea of food security, that the notion of a prepper these days has been like, is this kind of like a crazy person in a bunker with a load of dried food and a load of ammunition, right? And my sense is that if we are indeed facing down a not just generational food security challenge, but perhaps, like in terms of a global situation, a millennial food security challenge, then that old school notion of prepping doesn't cut it. Just doesn't cut it. What actually will prepare us, what actually will support us to flourish, is powerful, empowered, loving, connected, flourishing communities, both communities of place and communities of interest. And so that's also going to be an exploration for this kind of new iteration and momentum of the Sovereign Human Show. Is how can this notion of sovereignty help us as individuals to flourish, and indeed how can it help us as communities to flourish? And indeed, perhaps, what does flourishing mean? Rather than just surviving, what might it be to flourish? And so, if you are tuned in, I'd love to see a comment or two about, what does flourishing mean to you, and what are some of the core elements that can support communities to flourish? Yeah, I'm really, really kind of curious to know that right now. So we are coming up on time. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. Wherever you've tuned in, I see we've had a few tuning on Facebook, and we've had some tuning on YouTube, I think. So if you have been tuning in, let me know. Hit me up in the comments, just so that I can kind of know you've been there, and perhaps can continue the conversations. And I'm excited to now recognize that there is some hardwiring and some software that I'm going to have to deal with, and perhaps the most clear aspect of dealing with is to begin to accept and to love. To accept and to love the brokenness that took place so that I could survive boarding school. To accept and to love the fact that I'm not wired like everyone. That whether it's ADHD or some other autistic aspects, that there are also profound gifts in that way of being wired. And that my neuro difference is never a reason to disappoint others. And yet it can always be a reason for me to find ways to continue to love myself and to continue to turn this unique neurology into gifts, into ways to be of service, ways to find my own sovereign path with love, with beauty. And I want to close by saying thank you. And I can feel a few tears coming as well, because it is such a gift to be able to create shows like this. Whenever I don't do it and then come back on, I forget just how much I've missed it. So thank you so much. Stay tuned for future live streams as I build out this awesome live streaming capacity. Hit me up with some questions and comments, and I really look forward to seeing you next show. As ever, stay sovereign, stay blessed.